Hello and welcome to this video on unemployment. Unemployment might sound quite straightforward, but it can be a bit tricky. For example, this chap here, would we say that he's unemployed for 364 days a year? As economists, we need to be accurate when we're talking about unemployment. And that's what we're going to look at in this video. What is meant by unemployment and a few key terms, what's going on in terms of the UK's employment levels, and lastly, the benefits and costs and types of unemployment. Let's start off with what we mean, our definitions of unemployment from an economist's perspective. Unemployment is when potential workers are without jobs. And potential workers are those of working age between 16 and 64 and able to work. And this group of people we call the labour force. The unemployment rate, which you often hear referred to in the news, is the percentage of the labour force without jobs. Some people are what we would describe as being economically inactive. In fact, you yourself might fall in this category. Those aged between 60 and 64 who are not available for work or not looking for work. So this would include full-time students, homemakers, sick, disabled, people who've taken early retirement, or people who are discouraged, they're not actively looking for work. So you might ask yourself, if you're a student watching this, would you say that you're unemployed? Probably not. Would you say that you're employed? Maybe not if you don't have a job. So we would class you as economically inactive, not unemployed. And this can be quite a large proportion of people. In fact, certain newspapers try and quantify this and come up with various estimates for how many people this actually is in the UK. Okay, so let's break down how we get to unemployment figures in the UK. Right, step one, let's take the population, everyone in the UK as a whole. Now let's remove people who are retired pensioners, so over 65 and retired, and children under 16. What we're left with is the working age population, people aged 16 to 64. Okay, now if we remove the people who are economically inactive, so all the students, the people who've taken early retirement, the long-term sick, we're left with the labour force. Now if we remove those people who are economically active and have jobs, we are left with the unemployed. So you can see there's a trickle-down effect here, which we narrow it down to get from the population to the working age population to the labour force and then to the number of people unemployed. A final key term here is underemployment. And that occurs when someone who is currently in employment but would like to work longer hours. It's become particularly relevant since the recession in 2008, and the number of people in this category increased by 47% between 2008 and 2012. So there's a number of reasons why people might flow in and out of unemployment. Perhaps they've been made redundant from a previous job, or they've resigned. Maybe they've left university and haven't yet started employment. Maybe they've finished a government training scheme and haven't gained employment. Maybe they've immigrated into the country and they haven't got a job lined up. These would all add to the stock of unemployed in the UK. But there might be reasons why people flow out of unemployment. If they retire, or they retire early, or they go back into full-time education, or they leave the country, or they join a training scheme, or if they're discouraged and become economically inactive, these would all be reasons why the stock of unemployment would go down. So how do we measure this? How do we measure the number of people who are unemployed in the UK? Well, there are two measures that we need to know about. The first one is known as the claimant count, and that is a measure of those people claiming unemployment benefits. So if you claim unemployment benefits from the government, they have a record of the number of people doing that, and they say, right, well, these people are unemployed. But you might spot, actually, that's not necessarily always the case. You can be unemployed without claiming benefits, perhaps if you live off your partner's savings, or you have some other means to support yourself. So a second approach to measuring unemployment is a labour force survey, and that is done out by an organisation called the International Labour Organization. And what they do is they survey approximately 60,000 households, and they ask people in those households, have they been looking for work in the past 4 weeks? Are they ready to start work within the next 2 weeks? And they use that measure to say that these people are unemployed but are actively seeking work, and therefore they can come up with an estimate across the whole country of how many people are unemployed. So when we look at the unemployment rates using the claimant count and the labour force survey, what we see is typically the claimant count rate is lower than the labour force survey rate. Okay, so we've looked at what is meant by unemployment. Now let's look at some trends in the UK. Start off with the employment rate. So the employment rate is measured as the percentage of the population of working age in full or part-time work. And we can see it's around 73-74% with a dip around 2008, 2009, 10 where we had the recession, and it has recovered since then and is now higher than it was previously. In this chart we can see the unemployment rate as measured by the Labour Force survey. And generally speaking, we can see over quite a long time period here from the 80s, it was higher. It's generally speaking fallen since throughout the 90s and noughties, quite a long period of falling unemployment. We can see a spike again when the recession happened. It plateaued for a while, and currently employment is on a general downward trend. One of the reasons behind this might be the rise in part-time employment. You can see this blue dotted line shows part-time employees as a percentage of total employment, and generally speaking, since the early 90s, that has been rising over time. One other useful trend to look at is the level of youth unemployment. The youth unemployment rate in the UK is quite high in comparison to how it's been in the previously, and is particularly significant. 15%, 19% compares quite highly to the overall unemployment rate of about 5%. Indeed, some countries have very high unemployment rates. Greece, Spain, Cyprus, Croatia all have high unemployment rates that far exceed the UK. One interesting statistic that occasionally rises is the fact that unemployment can be rising, the number of people unemployed without jobs can be rising, at the same time as the number of people with jobs can be rising. So I want to pause the video for a second and think, well, how can this be? How can there be more people with jobs and also more people without jobs at the same time? Well, one answer might be immigration. So while there may be more redundancies and unemployment rises, there are actually more people entering the country and taking up work, so there may be more people in work as well. Okay, benefits, costs, and types of unemployment. So the costs of unemployment. What are the costs to the economy, to the individual of being unemployed? Well, the cost to the economy might be lost output. Whilst they're unemployed, they're not producing any goods and services, we might see an impact in GDP. It also worsens the government's finances when you become unemployed. If you then claim benefits, that is a payment the government has to make. Also, if you don't have a job, you're not going to be paying things like income tax, which lessens the amount of money the government receives. So if the government pays more and receives less, they're going to have what we call a deficit. There's been lots of statistics and studies that have shown there's a link between unemployment and worsening health, including mental health. And indeed, this may result in increased crime levels, although this trend doesn't seem to be as significant these days. Finally, a cost of unemployment is a loss of income and therefore a loss of living standards to the individual. Long-term persistent unemployment may lead to social unrest. A loss of skills. The longer a person is out of work, the more likely is they'll lose the skills that they had previously acquired. The social effects tend to find their way onto the poorest workers within society, and most economists would argue that long-term unemployment is the most severe. Just being unemployed for a few weeks between jobs is not as significant. Are there any benefits of unemployment? Well, potentially a chance to update skills, maybe go back and do some training or some courses. If there's lots of unemployed people, firms can hire them and so could expand quicker. Having lots of unemployed people in the economy may help keep wages down for businesses, keeping their products competitive. And overall, there may be lower inflation in the economy as demand is suppressed and costs to businesses are lower. Okay, now let's move on to types of employment. There are 6 types of employment that we need to be aware of. The first type of unemployment is frictional unemployment. And that is unemployment caused by workers being between jobs. So you finish your job, you've got another job starting in 2 weeks. Now for that 2-week period, you are technically unemployed, but actually, is this a problem? A lot of people would argue it's not a significant or serious type of unemployment. But it is a reason why you'll always have some unemployment, frictional unemployment. Potentially more serious is structural unemployment, and that's where an industry declines and leaves behind a group of workers with the wrong skills. For example, think of shipbuilding in the UK. Various areas of the UK used to have strong shipbuilding industries, but when the shipbuilding industry moved business abroad to other countries, those workers were left behind with shipbuilding skills, but they weren't actually appropriate for them to pick up new work. Those people we would describe as being structurally unemployed. That can be quite significant, and we would often argue there's a strong emphasis on governments in that situation to retrain those people who've been left behind. Okay, two more. Cyclical and demand efficient. That unemployment comes about because there is low demand in the economy. And if there is low aggregate demand in the economy and less is being produced, then we need less workers. They're being made unemployed. We call that cyclical or demand efficient unemployment. Classical unemployment is where people are unemployed because the wage rate is above a wage rate that would clear that market. So for example, if the wage rate was currently $7.25, both workers might have a job. But if, let's say, they joined a trade union or a law was passed that meant that the wage rate had to be $10.10 an hour, then actually this one might be fired and this one might be maintained. Now, the cause of this person here's unemployment has been the wage pressure, because wages are deliberately maintained above what we might describe as being an equilibrium level. We call that classical unemployment. Okay, fifth and sixth, seasonal unemployment. That is when workers are unemployed at certain times of the year, such as building workers or agricultural workers in winter, or maybe someone who works as a lifeguard in the summer might find they're out of work in the winter. That would be seasonal unemployment. And the final type of unemployment is regional unemployment. And that is where unemployment is concentrated in certain areas, often due to a lack of factor mobility, particularly. And what we mean by this is it's hard for people to move around. So for example, there may be a job going in the southeast in London, but you work in the northeast, but you can't move there to take up that job. So you stay in the northeast and unemployed. And why might that be the case? Well, it might be you can't afford a house in London because it's so expensive. So you have to stay in the northeast. There is no job for you there, and so you're unemployed. So regional unemployment is where unemployment is concentrated in certain areas because people find it difficult to move around for whatever reason it might be. Here are some key terms to check that we've got down. So these are useful key terms to have on this topic. And we've looked at what is meant by unemployment, the UK's employment levels, benefit costs and types of unemployment in this video. That's it. Thank you very much.